Alright, so I'm going to start off with a pretty easy question. Who here likes food? Alright, well that's really weird because everyone just raised their hand. Because it seems like a silly question, right? Who doesn't like food? We all need to eat for one thing, and it usually tastes good. But something that I notice about people my age, and this includes myself, is that we really seem to like food. This is evident in the world around us. We have things like Food Network, which is a channel that's completely dedicated to cooking and eating and celebrity chefs. We have a hashtag food porn, so you can do a Google search or on Instagram and just scroll through thousands of really mouth-watering pictures of food. We have food trends like food trucks and kale, and you know that when Emerson Dining Hall is advertising that kale's a new superfood, it must be a trend. But when I would talk to my parents about their childhoods growing up, I realized that they didn't grow up with the same kind of preoccupation with food that we seem to have today. And so that's what my talk tonight is going to be about, why food has become such a big part of our generation, the Millennials. So my talk has this, or the title of my talk has this word foodie in it, which is maybe a term you've heard used before, and it's maybe a term you would use to describe yourself. Like I said in the introduction, I would consider myself a foodie. I like to eat, I like to cook and bake, I like talking about food. Obviously, I'm sitting here or standing here and talking in front of all of you today. But what does it mean to be a foodie? Is this person a foodie, someone who's always taking Instagram pictures, right? Which, by the way, if you do this, it's totally fine. I'm not going to judge you. I do it myself, right? So don't be embarrassed. But where does this term come from? So it comes out of the 1980s. Even though we think that foodie is kind of a term that's come more popularity now, it's really been around for about 30 years now. And it's coined by these two journalists. They write this book called The Official Foodie Handbook. And it's basically a how-to manual of how to be a foodie. So things like what to eat, what restaurants to frequent, what are some of the mannerisms you're supposed to adopt. And funnily enough, this book is actually satire. So they're making fun of the foodie culture because these journalists saw the attitudes and behaviors that people were taking toward food, and they thought that it was kind of absurd. So for example, they characterized someone they called the olive oil whore, and they portrayed this guy as a really pompous and snobbish figure who tells you that the right way to buy olive oil is to rub some in your palm and smell it, and he actually has gone to Italy in order to learn how to do this. So you can see it's, they're making fun of it. The Foodie Handbook, it describes a foodie as typically an aspiring professional couple for whom food is a fashion. You don't live with the same menu for years. You discover, you embrace, you explore minutely, get bored, and move on tomorrow to fresh meals and pastas new. And so you might be saying, hey, isn't this supposed to be a satire? This actually sounds kind of accurate. And I actually wouldn't argue with you. I think there are people out there who call themselves foodies, and nevertheless, they are still foodies. But we might think of them more like food snobs. But this is just one variation of a foodie. I think the basis of a definition is someone who's passionate about food, someone who takes particular interest in it. It doesn't mean that you're going out and eating every night and bragging to everyone about your latest food adventure. But you do really have an interest within food culture. So how did we get to be this foodie generation? Because like Brian said, you don't just wake up one day and decide to do something. Something had happened. So part of this has to do with our point in history. If you think about it, our grandparents grew up in the Great Depression and World War II, so food was scarce, and they didn't have access to the same kind of things that we do, things like sugar and meat that we kind of take for granted, but those kind of items were rationed back then. With our parents' generation and the baby boomers, there's really this emphasis on food fast, and so you can see from these two ads that I pulled from the 1950s that Chef Boyardee and Minute Rice are showing you that you can take food out of a can or out of a box and have it prepared in a meal within a few minutes. We can see a beginning of food awareness and consciousness with the 1970s. They have an organic food movement, but it's not until the beginning of what we call the millennial generation in the 1980s that this really becomes a mainstream thing. And we've decided that we're going to take a different approach to food. For one thing, we don't have the scarcity that our grandparents had to deal with, and in fact, we have a lot more ingredients and cuisines that we are able to access because of things like globalization and increased transportation. And even though the world has continued to move even faster, we still have decided that we're going to slow down when it comes to our approach to food and think about things like where it comes from and how it's being produced, and again, being creative and innovative with it. So we're to us, the Millennials, and we take the slow approach to food, and we decided that it's not just going to be something that we eat and consume in order to survive, but really something that is integral to our social fabric. And in part, it's become part of our social fabric because of social media. So, now that you guys laugh, because I thought really hard about this when I made this slide. So social media, by no surprise to any of us, has really changed the way that we connect and communicate with people. And so eating is something, not that it's just kind of part of our daily routine, but it's become something to be celebrated and shared. So we have all different kind of platforms to do this. Foursquare, you can check in and let people know who you're with and where you're at. You can tweet play-by-plays of what you're doing and what you're thinking about food. You can Instagram and document how everything looked. And it is true that you can add a vintage filter to just about anything and it looks good. But you can also review on Yelp or Urban Spoon about what you thought about where you went. And this doesn't have to just apply to a restaurant experience. It could be any kind of food experience, a new recipe or some kind of new thing that you're trying. So I don't have my notes on me. So social media has really changed the way that we communicate and connect, and obviously this allows us to reach a much broader audience, and it enables foodie culture to really be widespread across the continent and across the globe. So we don't have just gastronomical hubs that are just concentrated in certain areas. Now we're able to have places and lists like this that tell us where the top foodie destinations in small towns. So you can see that it's not just New York or LA where food conversation and culinary innovation is happening. It's really happening all across in maybe more obscure places. And so this way, trends are able to spread much more easily because people are able to communicate with each other and see what other foodies are doing, thinking, and obviously eating, and then bring that hopefully to their local areas or be creative themselves. What else has happened that has helped spread this foodie culture and a foodie generation? Well, there's really been a message that anyone can cook, right? Like Ratatouille. So we should just all take our messages from Disney. But really there has been this ever decreasing gap between food professionals, so people who are in the industry, like restaurant owners and chefs and food writers, food critics, and the everyday public. So we're much more able to have access to that information, also being able to follow them on Twitter or Instagram, so through social media. And it doesn't just apply to cooking, it's really being involved with food conversations. So if you are following people like Jamie Oliver, who's a restaurant owner and chef, or the editor of Bon Appetit magazine, you get to see what's going on in their kitchens and what they're thinking about food and how they perceive trends. And so in this way, you're able to be an active participant in what's happening in the industry. You're not just someone who goes to a restaurant and then leaves. You, like I mentioned earlier, could go through and review it or make your own comments on what's happening in the food industry. So all this has done is really feed the public's interest and involvement in food. So what does this all mean? Well, also, I forgot to mention this, we now have a lot more people who are involved in the food conversations that aren't necessarily culinary within the industry and culinary chefs. So for instance, this is a blog that I happen to like, and it just shows that ordinary people can be involved and participate in this foodie culture and foodie generation. So it's all come to, well, if MasterChef Junior is any kind of indication, the foodie generation isn't just going to end with us. It's something that's going to continue. And if you ever want to feel bad about your culinary skills, do watch this show, because I can absolutely guarantee that these 9-year-old chefs will completely outperform like 99% of us that are in this room. But I hope that this talk has, given you some food for thought. Right? I had a note in there somewhere. But whether you think that being a foodie is a good thing or a bad thing, if you're tired of seeing people Instagramming food all the time, it nevertheless is something that is part of our society and our generation, and something that looks like it's going to be continuing on in the future. Thank you.